everyone. Welcome back to Doodling Through Education. This is CC Cycle 3, Week 14 History. For everybody else, that just means that we are going to be talking about some of the main tycoons that led up to the industrial age in our country in the 1800s. So, before we get started, I wanted to remind you to subscribe to this channel if you haven't, so you never miss an episode. Without further ado, let's start doodling. In the late 1800s, there were several main tycoons that fueled the nation's industrial age. The first tycoon that we'll talk about is Cornelius Vanderbilt. Cornelius Vanderbilt was a shipping and railroad tycoon. As a young boy, he often went with his father to go to work, and his father operated a boat which ferried cargo between Staten Island and Manhattan. When Vanderbilt grew up, he made his money in the steamship business and later invested in railroads. In 1817, Vanderbilt went to work as a ferry captain for a wealthy businessman who owned a commercial steamboat service that operated between New Jersey and New York. This job was important for Vanderbilt because it provided the opportunity for him to learn about this steamship industry. In the late 1820s, he set out into business on his own. He built steamships and operated ferry lines around the New York region. By the 1850s, he had turned his attention to railroads. He bought up so much stock in the New York and Harlem Railroad that by 1863, he owned this line. He later went on to purchase the Hudson River Railroad and the New York Central Railroad and made them into one rail line in 1869. In 1873, Vanderbilt was able to offer the first rail service from New York City to Chicago. And during the last years of his life, he ordered the construction of Grand Central Depot, which later on turned into Grand Central Terminal in New York City. This project gave jobs to thousands of people. Let's move on to our next tycoon. We are going to talk about John D. Rockefeller. He was the founder of the Standard Oil Company. His early life was spent in New York, where he was born, but a little later on, his family moved to Cleveland, Ohio. As an adult in 1865, he borrowed money to buy out some of his partners and take control of an oil refinery, which became the largest in Cleveland. Over the next few years, he sought to add new partners and expanded his business interests in this growing oil industry. At the time, kerosene, which was derived from petroleum and used in lamps, was becoming a staple in the economy. In 1870, Rockefeller formed his famous Standard Oil Company of Ohio. He was the president and largest shareholder. His company, Standard Oil, gained a monopoly in the oil industry by developing companies for distributing and marketing his products around the globe. In 1882, all of his companies were combined into the Standard Oil Trust, which controlled about 90% of the nation's refineries and pipelines. Rockefeller retired in the mid-1890s. Next up in our tycoons is Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was actually born in Scotland, and he was born to a family who did not have a lot of money. His family decided to move to America and search for better opportunities. At this point, Carnegie actually ended his formal education and instead took on a job as a bobbin boy at the cotton factory in the town he lived in. He did this to help support his family. As he grew up, he held a series of jobs. one being at a railroad. Into his adulthood, Carnegie showed an interest in the business world and started diving into it. With the U.S. railroad industry then entering a period of rapid growth, he expanded his railroad investments and he went to work at an iron bridge building company called Keystone Bridge Company. This gave him connections. By the time he was in his early 30s, Carnegie had become a very successful businessman. In the early 1870s, Carnegie co-founded his first steel company near Pittsburgh. Over the next few decades, he created his steel empire. And he did this by maximizing his profits and minimizing his inefficiency through ownership of factories, raw materials, and transportation. In 1892, he combined everything he owned to form the Carnegie Steel Company. Later in his life, Carnegie sold his steel company and retired from business and then devoted himself to philanthropy. Next up and last, we are going to talk about Gustavus Franklin Swift. He innovated the meat industry. Swift was the son of a butcher, and he grew up watching the inefficiencies involved with shipping livestock. They required many things like herding, large stock cars, and slaughterhouses, which were very, very costly, and many of the animals even died on the journey. So he insisted on the crazy idea of shipping already butchered meat instead to his Chicago packaging plant. Swift was famous for finding an engineer to help him design a transport system for this already butchered meat. He decided that the meat should be stacked together in the center of a boxcar, and this would prevent it from overturning, while ice would chill the meat on its route from the East Coast. When local butchers and railroads tried blocking his business, Swift partnered with a Canadian railroad to get around their blockade. Under Swift's control, nothing went to waste. All the normally unusable leftovers were turned into products like soap, fertilizer, buttons, and medications. Swift owned as much of the production process as he could. He raised the cattle, sent them to the butchers, and was involved in most of the process. His cost-cutting methods became an early example for those famous companies that we just talked about, Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel. And that's all we have for today. This week, I'd like you to choose one of the men that we talked about in this video and study him further. You could study things like his early life or his personal life, or you can even dive deeper into his business life. Try and figure out what specific things contributed to our country's industrial age. And on that note, remember to be kind, follow God's will, and take care. Bye.